Feminists have long found Game of Thrones problematic. This is an article from 2014. Game of Thrones, too much racism and sexism, so I stopped watching. After yet another rape scene, I no longer trust the creators to bridge the gap of thoughtful conversation between action and intent, so I've given up on Game of Thrones for good. Well, are you surprised? He's portraying an analogy for something analogous to a pre-modern society, which obviously doesn't include human rights. It's meant to be a feudal world, so of course there's racism and sexism. Why would there not be? It would be strange to think that that would be just not the case. Why would the world of Game of Thrones be progressive? Obviously it wasn't. And so this leads us up to now, or actually about a week ago, so not the latest finale, but the episode in which Daenerys Targaryen decides to burn down King's Landing. Well, that wasn't well received at all, was it? Game of Thrones has betrayed the women who made it great. Once you could have argued it was a feminist show, but now Game of Thrones is letting down its female characters in a shockingly tone-deaf way, from an unstable Daenerys to a weeping Brienne. Okay, I don't agree. Fundamentally, the women in Game of Thrones have always been quite humanized, in my eyes. They've gone through the suffering that is required to develop character, and in the last season, in Season 8, the women have been flattened into two-dimensional caricatures of each other. They're not even different women at this point. They're all basically the same woman playing basically the same power game, and I found it really annoying. While everyone else is, all the other characters like milling around and doing hard work to prepare for the siege and all this, the women just wandering around, giving each other the side eye, and just playing like some power game at the very end of the world, and it seems deeply irresponsible and bloody pointless. Until recently, you could make the argument that Game of Thrones was a stealthily feminist show. In its early years, it might have lured in the typical male fantasy crowd with sex, violence, and alpha male characters. But before you knew it, a woman was on the Iron Throne, her main challenger was also a woman, and Westeros was stuffed full of female assassins, knights, wily politicos, and Dame Diana Rigg. Yeah, it seems that it kind of got co-opted by feminist pressure in Hollywood, doesn't it? But anyway, sure, there's still the show still asked us to ogle. Sure, the show still asked us to ogle naked female bodies once a week, but there was still a worryingly relaxed attitude to rape, but we fancy-loving female viewers have learned to take our victories where we can, and Game of Thrones was one of them. Well, that must be a rather disappointing thing if you are looking at this through the lens of a female power fantasy where women never fail. Why would you look to Game of Thrones? Everyone else has failed. Everyone in the show takes their knocks. And some people are, I guess, Gary Stews and end up coming back to life after they get murdered. Not that that really wrapped up properly anyway, but never mind. It's so frustrating to see the show slip back into its old ways in the season finale. Or the final season, sorry. Coming back off the long night's excellent twist ending where Arya, rather than the expected hero Jon Snow, killed the Night King. Yes, the pointless... I mean, I just can't even get over it. Like, what was the thought process behind it? What connection did Arya have to the Night King? Why her? Why in the first battle that the Night King is actually engaged in? Why that? It seems like a way of essentially playing up to the feminist crowd. Say, hey, look, we know that you want this, so we're going to give you this, even though it makes no narrative sense. I like the honesty of this author here, though. Personally, I'm thoroughly enjoying Daenerys' descent into complete megalomania. Anyone who thinks it's an unbelievable character shift for her weren't paying attention during her 7 straight seasons of setting people on fire, setting people who didn't agree with her on fire. Now, I completely agree with that. Like, Daenerys has always shown the key signs of a tyrant, utterly merciless to the people that she considers to be oppressing, the innocent, underclasses and whatnot, and she's always had a very dark streak in her. So I also don't believe that this is out of character for her. I just think that season 8 has been so poorly written by the two guys writing it that any impact that would have about the sympathetic nature of people who strive for power and how power corrupts and how these kind of inbuilt character flaws will end up manifesting when huge amounts of pressure are put on someone, and there's a lot at stake and there are big consequences. That's been poorly executed in my view, but it was definitely where George Martin was going with this, and it's definitely how this should have ended. She was always destined to become a tyrant, and I find it interesting how feminists broadly were not able to see that, and this particular feminist, or this particular author, actually does get that. That's the point. They know that that is actually where Daenerys' story arc was heading, to show that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Daenerys was never going to be the right person for the Iron Throne, and neither is Cersei, who has a history of blowing up her enemies. Yeah, to be fair, in Cersei's case, I actually find it more forgivable. I mean, they were at least her enemies. Why is King's Landing the enemy of Daenerys Targaryen? Why are the people of that city the enemy of this woman? I really don't think they are. But at least Cersei didn't just go genocidal on her own people and actually killed her political enemies, which I guess is appropriate in a world like Game of Thrones. So having two female villains is not at all anti-feminist. In fact, it's refreshing. Also, I agree. I think it's a very interesting take, which is why it's so annoying when you get characters like Brienne of Tarth and Arya Stark, who are also being made up to be essentially invulnerable superwomen. It's like, well, and the worst part about this is that Arya Stark isn't even a Mary Sue. She's been through the fire. She's gone through her trials and her suffering. But the problem is now she's being portrayed as if she's invulnerable. She's been given superpowers. And it's like, no, she might just be able to scrape through though, because of the level of difficulty of the opponents that she's facing. The Night King should have been a hard fight for whoever fought him. But instead, she just kills him in one. Don't worry about it. Sansa's brutal treatment at the hands of Ramsay Bolton was used against her twice. I forgave the show for its cruel treatment of Sansa a season ago, when it became clear that her story was one of survival rather than victimhood. Again, an excellent story arc. Yes, Sansa went through the cruelty that one has to go through in order to fully actualize as a character. That's not like a good thing, but it's a necessary thing for us to believe that the character can overcome. And as you say, it's a story of empowerment after suffering, rather than being the eternal victim of the things that happen to you. But this is the complaint. Thrones rarely passes up an opportunity to remind us of her rapes. It undermines a character who has refused to be beaten or defined by her suffering, especially when in the latest episode she credits her abuse for transforming her from a little bird to what she is now. Well, that's true. That's the point of the character's character arc. It was Sansa and Sansa alone who transformed herself into the strong and savvy leader she is, not the men who abused and manipulated her. Yeah, but you're acting like there weren't also men who tried to help her. I mean, Tyrion, in Sansa's opinion, is a genuinely good man, and I don't see why he can't be credited in any way for helping her develop the personal strength that she has. No man is an island, or woman in this case. Everyone relies on someone else around them. So why does Sansa, why do all of the other characters have to be their own little islands of majesty? It's not realistic. It makes the characters look, well, fake and transparent, two-dimensional. But if the writers don't understand that, how can we trust them to tell Sansa's story properly? Well, for a start, these writers are shit, so you can't trust them to tell any story properly. But that's not actually the most important thing about Sansa. The most important thing about Sansa is the fact that there are good people in the world and bad people in the world, and she has had terrible experiences with the bad people, and yet still does not pathologize the good people because of what happened to her. It's not that it's Sansa alone. That's the thing. There are other things in this, and these networks, these relationships that Sansa builds, are what makes the characters interesting and dynamic and realistic. You saying, oh, it's Sansa and Sansa alone. No, that's just not realistic. Nobody really does all of this on their own, although it is up to you to make sure that you do this. There will be other people in your life who will help you with this, and you should credit them properly. Saying, oh, it's me alone, no, that's arrogant. There are other people who helped. They should be credited. Worst of all, though, was the treatment of Missandei. As Game of Thrones' only regular female character of colour... Oh, fucking hell. What, was she? I don't know. I didn't even think about it. This show has a responsibility not to mess her arc up. Good luck. Yet we found ourselves watching a former slave who had only wanted to return to the home country she was stolen from, who had been dedicated the last few years of her life to helping Daenerys wipe out slavery, get captured and beheaded while handcuffed, also that her death could give Daenerys the final justification she needed to burn this mother down. Yeah, I found that really transparently bad. I mean, it's obviously not the people of King's Landing's fault that the mountain under the direction of Cersei beheaded her. I mean, how they even knew that Missandei was anything to anyone is a mystery, because really, what did she actually do? Like, she dedicated herself to this. She stood around while Daenerys was telling people what to do, and then she gave advice afterwards. I mean, she really wasn't that much of an important character, but she was the only regular female character of colour, therefore she is important suddenly. It's worth pointing out that not every female character is currently being let down. Arya rejecting Gendry's proposal was pure Arya. No, and again, if I recall correctly, Gendry is the smith that she's kind of taken a liking to. If a man treated a woman that way, we would think he was some kind of Me Too candidate. The way she was acting towards him, and the way that their relationship, quote unquote, seems to work is just bad. And again, it comes from Arya being like some embodiment of female power that is not really very realistic. And again, and it's a real shame, because Arya's character, she was never this kind of cold, arrogant superwoman. She was actually a lot more nuanced, if I dare use the word, and insightful. She was observant. The scenes with her and Tywin Lannister are just some of the best television I've ever watched. The dynamic is incredible. The layers to what their interaction is, when he's obviously worked out that she's not who she says she is, and she now has to maintain this and still challenge him, which is why he finds her interesting, and all due to the massive social power difference, him being like a duke or whatever, and her being a peasant girl, theoretically. That's a fucking fascinating scene to end up creating, and truly some of the best storytelling I've ever seen in anything. But it doesn't matter, fuck it. Arya's just an invincible superwoman who can kill the Night King first try. Don't worry about it. That's more interesting, really, isn't it? But what I find interesting is that it's not just that they're hurting women in Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones fans criticize writers for humanizing Cersei to vilify Daenerys. Now it's a competition between the two women, because obviously they weren't bigging up Cersei, because Cersei is obviously evil. Cersei is obviously self-centered, obviously going to do any kind of damage that she can to anyone who threatens her position at the top of the pyramid. And Daenerys is frankly turning into exactly the same. Again, poorly, because the writing in this series and this season has been unbelievably bad, but Daenerys is also the same kind of character, because frankly, the women in Game of Thrones are not always tyrants, but the ones who are put in charge are definitely tyrants. They do not listen to their underlings. They view their underlings as a threat. And, like, for example, the Daenerys-Jon Snow relationship. Just marry. Marry and the whole thing goes away. Oh, he's her aunt. She's his aunt, sorry. No one cares. They've already fucked. No one gives a damn. It really does not matter. But anyway, the penultimate episode of Game of Thrones has left many fans uncomfortable with the depiction of the two leading female characters. As the HBO series geared up for its final ever outing, the trailer for which you can see here, blah blah, she seemingly swapped personalities with Cersei in the process. No, this is an archetype. If you are seeking to be an autocrat, this is the kind of person that you are. And even then, this is a bad autocrat. Like, Tywin Lannister was effectively that kind of archetype as well, but he was smart. He was not just brutal for the sake of being brutal. He knew when to be brutal, and he knew when not to be brutal. He played the game very well. The female characters in this final series don't do that, and they do not play the game well, and we see the results of their failures. Losing Jorah, Missandei and Rhaegal, as well as her claim to the throne, has left viewers fearful that writers were planning on undoing the character's empowering 7 seasons. And it turns out for good reason. After Lannister forces surrendered to the Dragon Queen, she took Missandei's final word literally and burnt King's Landing to the ground. Viewers pointed out that, up until now, Cersei has been the most merciless character on the series, and to humanize her in a bid to bring Daenerys down is a problematic move, especially when Dany was doing a good job of vilifying herself. Look, there's nothing wrong with humanizing a character that has come to the logical end of the tyrannical course of action that they've taken, to show that that person has regrets, to show that they've realized that they fucked up, to show that they realize that, look, they've overplayed their hand. That's actually a really interesting thing to do. And it doesn't actually have to bring Daenerys down. Like you say, she's doing a good enough job of that herself because she's always had that tyrannical streak in her character. However, some feminists didn't want to see this. And honestly, I think that these women who idolized Daenerys Targaryen for taking revenge on all of those people who had wronged her and wronged other people throughout the course of the series are the same kind of character, sort of archetype, that would end up doing the same thing. However, when you start getting genocidal to maintain your position of power, it looks bad, and no one wants to think, well, that might be me, even though it might be them. So now Game of Thrones has failed Daenerys Targaryen. Oh, she was an icon, she was an idol. It's not that this their character that they're writing poorly now to show that anyone can be a tyrant, even a well-meaning young lady can be a tyrant if given the opportunity. Oh no, there was meant to be something else that was supposed to happen for Daenerys, even though this was the completely logical conclusion of everything that she has done so far. I mean, look at this quote that they give us. I am Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen of the blood of old Valyria. I am the dragon's daughter, and I swear to you, those who'd harm you will die screaming. Not a very nice thing to say. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm sure the people who would harm them aren't very nice people, but to enjoy this kind of level of vengeance is sadism. It is not responsible, it does not set a good example, and it just legitimizes the person who comes after you, who's going to do even worse. So they say that the quote has been passed around this week in the aftermath of the show's most recent episode, The Bells, to prove that Daenerys has always been hungry for vengeance, quick to kill and prone to madness. I don't know about prone to madness, but she's definitely been hungry for vengeance and quick to kill. Out of context, the quote might sound alarming, but it's seen this full, is powerful and liberating. No, it's sadistic. It's about taking pleasure in harming people. It's revenge. It's not a good thing. It makes of you a worse person. It comes after Daenerys offers freedom to any who seek it and comes with a qualifier. She will only kill those who'd harm you, meaning slavers, rapists and pillagers. Okay, but how are we any different to them if we are going to take pleasure in hurting others? Because that's the problem that they have. They take pleasure in hurting others. You shouldn't, full stop, take any pleasure in hurting anyone. This is the Daenerys Targaryen we've always known, an orphan girl turned abused woman whose kind heart always swayed her from the inherited mental illness and from the trauma that threatened to swallow her whole. She's imperfect, too idealistic, and in her focus on legacy has allowed for much failure, but she was never a monster, she was never mad. I don't agree. I don't agree that she was ever, really particularly kind-hearted. I mean, to be fair, she probably could have been a lot worse given things that have happened to her. But again, you start with this mindset that sadism is okay to a certain kind of person. We just have to make sure that we're in a position to do that to that certain kind of person. And eventually, with enough justification, well, Missandei died, it's the fault of King's Landing for not rising up against Cersei, which means I get to kill them all. They are suddenly all responsible, and suddenly now she can take pleasure in burning innocent people alive. That was always there. That was always going to be something about her character that came out when she was finally powerful enough to do it. Again, it was written really poorly. It could have been written so much better, but it would have had the same impact and it actually would have had meaning. It was just handled poorly by the two writers. But it's because she's a woman that we have to whine about this. How on earth does that track with what we know of Daenerys? How do we reconcile the woman who 2 seasons ago locked her dragons in a tomb for burning a child, with the person who would ruthlessly destroy a city of innocent children after winning the only thing she ever cared about? Look, right, locking her dragons in a tomb, even if they burned a child, is not really a very appropriate thing unless we consider the dragons to actually be moral agents. Now, I don't know what the level of intelligence of the dragons is meant to be. I mean, it's obviously quite high, but, I mean, they are dragons. Do they understand that they're being punished for this? I mean, I don't know. I'll just assume they are, right? There is a world where Daenerys going rogue makes sense, but this isn't it. This was an irresponsible, irrevocable undoing of an arc that enthralled and empowered a generation. No, that's the thing, right? Daenerys was never a character about empowerment. It was always about how, if you are allowed to operate without any strings on you, you end up becoming corrupted by your power and end up going mad, or at least what appears to be mad. So the point is, she wasn't meant to be a feminist hero. If anything, she's meant to be a feminist villain. She's meant to be a warning to other feminists. Listen, right? You might be gaining power now, but be careful, because you might find yourself in a sort of revenge-driven mindset, justifying hurting people and enjoying hurting people who you perceive to have hurt others, even if they may not have done. So you can sit there and say, well, I don't like what she's done, sure, but are the young men in schools now who are being taught in an environment that doesn't suit them the patriarchy? But in your attempt to smash the patriarchy, they are acceptable casualties. In fact, it might even be desirable if men, just get knocked down a few pegs because of, after all this time that we were oppressed as women. Do you see what I'm going with this? You can justify anything if you can pathologize one group. It's got to stop. But the thing is, you're misinterpreting what's going on here. It sends a dangerous message that women who seek power will piss it away the second their emotions kick in. No, that's not what they're saying. Daenerys hasn't lost any power. She's still a massive tyrant. That's the problem. She hasn't lost it. She just doesn't know when she shouldn't do it. And it comes from the mindset of grievance, of vengeance, and of sadism that feminists seem to also share. Which is probably why you enjoyed it so much when she wasn't doing terrible things, but don't like to think that you yourselves might end up doing terrible things, even though I think you probably are. The show made a decision, likely based on the blueprints of George R.R. Martin's unfinished story, but it laid the bricks haphazardly. It's dangerous what's been done to Dany, because it hinges her carefully deployed conquest. No, it wasn't. Was not careful. On the unpredictability of feminine desire. No, it shows that there is a tyrannical side to female nature as well as a nurturing side. Female nature is not just pureness and light. Neither is male nature before you say, oh, but what about toxic masculinity? Yes, there are things men can do that are horrible and tyrannical and hurtful, but there are also things that women do that are the same way. Daenerys is a warning about those things. That's what feels more out of nowhere than her fiery inclinations. The presentation of Dany as not only prone to her worst impulses, but careless in her actions. That's not the Daenerys who stood before the Khalasar and pledged her life to the common folk. That's not the breaker of chains. That's the point. She is changing and developing as a character, as a person. And as you, as the feminist, gain more power in the world, you have to be careful about how you wield it. This is the lesson that you should be taking from Daenerys Targaryen. But anyway, if this is what the male-only creators think passes for earned female villainy, one has to wonder about the intentions of telling this story in the first place. As a warning to you. That's what. So naturally, we come to Slate.com. Well, now that she's an awful tyrant and everyone hates her, Daenerys doesn't have to be a feminist hero. In fact, was she ever a feminist hero? Have we ever done anything wrong? Is this reflective of what we would be like? No, of course not. This is nothing. She's not a real feminist, you have to understand. The role of women in Game of Thrones was not entirely clear when it premiered in 2012, neither were the future events that would make those fictional women so allegorically powerful. I agree, they are allegorically powerful. That's a great way of setting it as well, actually, which is why it's all the more important that you own what Daenerys has become. Game of Thrones debuted during the relative stability of the Obama era America. Oh yeah, here we go. And seemed to share with the then president kind of wonkish technocratic approach to the genre. Did it? As the detail-oriented Game of Thrones faded during the show's pell-mell dash towards completion, its biggest themes have become front-page news. The morality of tyranny, the intractable conflict between would-be countrymen, and last but certainly not least, what does a qualified woman have to do to win power over less qualified would-be autocrat anyway? Daenerys had to win. She had to fight a battle to defeat Cersei. That's what. The idea that you think either of these people are qualified is quite mad, because there are no qualifications other than being born what you are. Both of these women were born into what they were. They did not earn a degree in it. Madness. Absolute madness, the way that the framing of this is just completely wrong. Anyway, Game of Thrones lends itself to endless dissection because it's such a ready scrimp on which to project whatever contemporary issue is at hand, which is what you're doing, isn't it? You can't talk about it in the context of Game of Thrones. You have to drag, well, I don't even know if they're relevant, but outside events into this to try and make more sense of this. And I don't even know if that's true. George Martin is obviously an excellent writer. He's obviously very, very experienced in the subject matter that he is basing this off, and I don't know how much of this is actually influenced by outside real-world politics. It might be that very little is, but anyway. I love the way that they're undermining Daenerys in so many little ways. Listen to this. Daenerys Targaryen has become the focal point for the slippage between reality and fiction. Despite being played by one of the weaker actresses in the cast, that's right, you didn't say that before she became a tyrant, but now she's an awful character. Well, I mean, she's always been quite bad as an actress, hasn't she? Dany has become an all-purpose stand-in for powerful women. You could even argue that Emilia Clarke's blank performance makes her a better screen upon which to project. I don't agree that it was a blank performance. I think that's unfair. I don't think her performance has been bad. But Dany is a strong female character, a badass, a freer of slaves, an inspirer of men, the mother of dragons. Perhaps her will to power was a touch messianic. A touch? Anyone who has that kind of messianic will to power is a dangerous person you should watch. But see how far a woman gets with Jon Snow's "or shucks, I don't want to rule" shtick. Well, look, you can call it a shtick, but that's the character of Jon Snow. It's completely within his character. He doesn't want power over others, whereas Daenerys does. That makes her dangerous and him a lot more safe. You can sit there and go, well, you know, he's just going to get it because he's a man. No, he's going to get it because he's morally responsible, and Daenerys is not. Dany shouldered the hopes, not so much of her would-be subjects. Yeah, exactly. It's not about other people, it's about herself. This is narcissistic in Daenerys' case. It's not in Jon's. Jon actually cares about the people around him. Daenerys only cares about herself because she's an egotistical tyrant. But the audience who could see in her a viable female candidate, well, I guess these are the Hillary Clinton voters. One with the dragonfire to hold her ground against less qualified men. Yeah, so she had a magical MacGuffin that meant that she could win without actually having to win like everyone else. She didn't have to be brilliant or clever or quick or strong or tough or inspiring, really, even though you think that she is. She just had a way around the men. She had the dragons. In this, they were enabled by the show, which for many seasons gave Dany a hero's arc, winning over armies, freeing sisters from slavery, encountering cynical men, convincing them she was truly special. Yeah, now that's interesting, isn't it? That makes her a very interesting character. A hero's arc that falls into villainy and tyranny is a very interesting character than a hero who just goes home, you know, walks off into the sunset with everything completed and solved and nobody hurt and everything great. That's way more interesting. It's much more of a lesson for people in the real world. Dany remained, for season upon season, the great blonde hope, making mistakes but continually learning, a despot who might actually be enlightened, a timely riff on the protagonist in a fantasy quest who believes he's destined for something great and always turns out to be right. Listen, right, most heroes in fantasy novels don't believe they're destined for greatness. They just go on for other reasons. But it's very interesting how you're like, the great blonde hope. What exactly is she the hope of? I think that it's the hope that you think you can carry on in a tyrannical manner and won't end up a tyrant. And I do think that feminists are aware, even if it's only subconsciously, that they have the dragon of their own, which is feminist identity politics, female identity politics. We don't allow men to play identity politics, but feminists have that on their side. It's tyrannical, which is probably why Daenerys appealed to so many feminists, and they were thinking, well, hopefully she can actually make this work without becoming the worst thing that we are expecting, and lo and behold, she becomes a genocidal maniac. Really makes you think, doesn't it? Game of Thrones' final season has hit Dany believers especially hard. See, that's the thing. You can't just go through your life being belligerent and tyrannical like Daenerys. She has always had this streak in her. It was inevitable that this was going to come out. This was obviously her plot arc. And frankly, I was looking forward to it on the assumption that it was going to be written well, because a fallen hero is a fascinating thing. Why they fall is the fascinating thing. And if feminists who love Daenerys find themselves in that mold, then A, you know you're hurting people along the way. You know you're kind of sadistic, saying, haha, kill all men's just a joke, blah, 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 blah. You know that you are essentially on the same path to self-destruction as Daenerys. Why don't you just stop now? Why don't you stop now and humanize the people you've been dehumanizing? So in delivering her genocidal ending, the show is hitting viewers in the nose extremely hard with an idea that has been latent since the beginning, that rooting for anyone is a loser's game. Well, that has always kind of been the point of Game of Thrones, isn't it? Underplaying this permitted many members of the audience to ignore that Dany has always been motivated by something fundamentally gross. The idea that she is destined to be a ruler. Wow, she's a real feminist, really, isn't she? It's women's time to rule now. Look at what men have made of the world. Step aside, men, let the women take over. Does this sound familiar at all? The idea that she's owed fealty of millions of people, that she will be a fantastic ruler despite having never demonstrated a knack for it, and instead see her as the allegorical dragon queen we want her to be. Wow, that's really brutal. Are you sure that she's not a feminist hero? Because she really sounds like one to me. Even if Dany had kept her bloodthirsty tendencies in check, she'd still leave Westeros where it had always been, waiting for the inevitable day that one of her nutty descendants terrorizes people with nuclear dragons. It's just allegorical. The Game of Thrones final stretch has been badly written and badly paced, not obscure. The overall story is still doing interesting work, forcing invested viewers into all sorts of morally awkward positions and posing questions that can actually be salubrious to think about in the fictional realm rather than life. How far does a ruler have to go before you break with them? What is an enlightened tyrant even? How much does gender influence our loyalty? Okay, look, no one's really thinking about how much does gender influence our loyalty. And if that's the case, then, I mean, Daenerys has had perfectly loyal people around her, apart from Varys. But the question really is, what is an enlightened tyrant even? That's the question, because I don't agree that there is such a thing. You just can't have one person having all of the power over a society and think that that person is not going to do a lot of damage. And it's never just that person, it's the pyramid of hierarchies that person sits at the top of that will end up doing the damage. So even if you think maybe you are the one enlightened tyrant, all of the other people who are actually making what you say happen have also got to be enlightened tyrants. And they're not going to be, let's be honest. Dany was always at best the lesser of numerous evils. Her downfall, which is also her ascension to the Iron Throne, happened in a dramatically inept way that is, nonetheless, in keeping with the larger moral lessons of the series. It is sloppy craftsmanship, but not, I don't believe, anti-feminist, as I saw suggested all over Twitter, though a few female writers might have kept the show from suggesting that Jon's sexual rejection was her final breaking point. Why? Why can't... I mean, I never bought the relationship between her and Jon, but why wouldn't that be a breaking point? If she genuinely was in love with Jon Snow, and I guess there's no reason that she shouldn't be, he's a good guy, if he's rejecting her, why wouldn't that be a breaking point? Why wouldn't that be something that was like a deep leaden just block in her soul that she can't get rid of and that makes her feel terrible? What's wrong with that? That's just part of normal human relationships, isn't it? Anyway, despite being set in some imagined backward medieval past, Game of Thrones is way ahead of us in having women in positions of actual authority. What are you talking about? You mean you had Hillary Clinton, who commanded something like, what was it, $2 billion or $3 billion worth? It was literally like over $1 billion worth of financial backing for her campaign. She had all of the system behind her, and still Trump won. Britain is currently ruled by women. Theresa May, Nicola Sturgeon, and the leader of the Welsh Assembly, whose name I can never remember. Then you've got Angela Merkel in Germany, and various other female leaders in various other places. It's not like women aren't in positions of actual authority. That's such a wild misrepresentation of what real life is like. And if we ever end up with those like Daenerys Targaryen, then that's not good, is it? That's something that women really have to, like feminists in particular, I think is a more accurate way of doing it. Because I don't think most women are tyrannical. Most women don't resent men. Most women don't want to see any kind of sadistic vengeance against them. But there is a certain kind of feminist that does, isn't there? Let's be honest. This means that Dany's mad woman arc does not have to stand for all women everywhere. Well, feminists don't stand for all women everywhere, but it does stand for all feminists everywhere. If you are going to play the tyrannical game of identity politics and get where you get to without fair means, but instead using foul means, then yes, you really have to look at the story of Daenerys Targaryen and wonder, is that going to end up being me? Will I be the tyrant on the top of the throne? Who knows? Not only did this episode feature one previous Mad Queen, Cersei, she's not mad, she was just Machiavellian, acting less than mad, and another female superhero, Arya, showing remarkable signs of humanity. No, they've all disappeared. Arya used to show great signs of humanity until this season. The only living non-idiot on the show is still the Queen of the North. Dany might have seemed at one point like the best female hope for Westeros, but she's not the last. Again, this is just Identity Politics 101, but like, it's not about women, really. It's about the character arc of someone who was born a certain thing and does not really understand the limits of their own power and the damage that they can do. And when they get into their head saying, well, you know what, I can do these things, I have license to do these things, even if I shouldn't have liberty to do these things, then where does it end? Where do feminists reign in their own power? And the point seems to be never. As soon as the archetypal feminist hero starts actually displaying tyrannical and genocidal and harmful behaviours when they reach the end of their sort of the logical conclusion of their own character arc, suddenly you're like, oh, no, not a real feminist, not a real feminist, not a real feminist. No. She was your feminist hero for the last, 6 years? You can own this. You can own her. She is a warning to feminists. This is what you might become, so be careful.